Thank you, Dominique. Yeah, so really quickly, for those of you who aren't familiar with extension, extensions is the outreach arm of the university. So it's organized into agriculture, natural resources, health and well-being, economic development. So the idea is to take the knowledge built in the university and make sure it reaches all the different people of the state. And most states have an extension service. Wisconsin has a particularly strong one. So I'm going to be talking to you about something I'm really excited about because I've done a lot of work in it, and I've actually worked with Dominique. Sedona's done some work in this area. I'm currently working with Professor Todd Newman. So, but what I'm specifically focused on today is aquatic plant management. So what happens once you get an aquatic invasive species on your lake? But first I'm going to set a backdrop. So first, why might people react to a aquatic invasive species in a particular way? And we believe some of that might be around some of the messages that have been used for the prevention of aquatic invasive species. Next, I'm going to talk about a study that we just had come out about a week or two ago in the Journal of Biological Invasions, which is the first study that we're aware about that actually looks at the perceptions of lakeshore property owners about what they think about how to manage aquatic invasive species. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the next steps that we're already working on in order to improve the way people manage aquatic invasive species in a more ecologically sound way. And I'll share with you some of the problems with the way that people are currently addressing it. So what's the problem here? This particular issue focuses on zebra mussels, but the basic issue with aquatic invasive species is that they can, but don't always, take over an ecosystem. So for instance, with zebra mussels, if you, apparently if you were to walk in some of the Great Lakes, you would be walking on zebra mussels the whole way. And they actually clear out the water and that kind of thing. And you might say well, who cares? But it does have effect. It affects, factories. It affects infrastructure. It affects recreation. And we're mostly going to be focusing on plants today, but I wanted to show you a bit about aquatic invasive species prevention messaging. This here is a beach. You can imagine walking on this and getting bloody feet. So you all, certainly those in life sciences communication, have heard about message framing and emphasis message framing specifically. But just for those of you who come from different disciplines, what I want to emphasize is that message framing broadly refers to the idea that the way that how information is conveyed can influence how people react to it. And emphasis message framing, there's different kinds of message framing. It prioritizes some aspects, certain ideas over other ideas and everything. And then metaphor, in this case, we're considering one form of message framing, one form of emphasis message framing. So when you think about aquatic invasive species, one of the common ways that it's communicated about is in a militaristic sense. In fact, if you think about it, the word invasive species has militaristic overtones. Some of the concerns there is that it might create kind of an unhealthy relationship with nature and kind of result in some of the things that I'm exploring today. And the idea of creating a fear-based ideology the level of fear may not correspond with the actual threat. So, further militaristic metaphors, you could see public enemies, noxious enemies. I myself have done some work in the past that I wouldn't necessarily repeat, having learned what I have now. But yeah. So another offensive kind of metaphor that has had a lot of reaction is this nativist or xenophobic metaphor. So you can see this kind of they don't belong here, the bad guys, unwelcome exotics. And the concern here is the same thing. Imagine if we use this for people. It would be deeply offensive. And so it can kind of, again, create an unhealthy way of thinking about nature. And it can also go the other direction. You can imagine in a diverse environment that there's some examples in previous studies that people want non-native plants because the area that they live in should welcome all kinds of different plants. And so there's some concerns here. This test, I also want to say, too, that we are not the first people. There's all kinds of pontification going on about the morality, righteously so, about what kinds of language should be used around invasive species. But one thing we did, and we were, I think, among the first to do it, perhaps the first, was actually test these empirically. And the reason is that the main reason to use like a nativist or militaristic metaphor is usually, well, we have to do this because that's what gets people engaged, right? So if it works for that, then there's some argument. But if it doesn't perform, say, better than science or a different emphasis message frame, then it's really not serving the purpose that it's supposed to. So these debates have been going on for a long time. This article here is from 2005. And there's actually a lot here. So I'm going to really quickly go over one study that lays the backdrop for what I'll mostly be talking about. That is actually testing these different message frames and seeing how they perform relative to each other. So what we basically wanted to look at is using a paid Facebook message test where you can compare different message frames in the real world. We wanted to test what was the lowest cost per click and how do these ads with different emphasis message frames perform on different metrics of interest. And broadly speaking, those are things like clicks, cost per click, reactions, shares, and comments. And we also looked at, I'm not going to be going into that as much today, but by gender. So again, tested 5 different message frames and spent about $5,000 on like about $1,000 for each message frame. And for that, we reached about 270,000 people. So from a reach standpoint, it's a pretty good investment, at least in terms of getting out in front of people. And I'm only going to focus on a couple message frames that are laying the backdrop for what we'll be talking about next. So you can target within Meta platforms, and this stands for Instagram or Facebook, all adults in Wisconsin, and you can also pick people's different interests. So we wanted people that had an interest in boating and fishing, and the reason for that is the people that are most likely to move aquatic invasive species are people, what we call transient anglers, those who move their boats between bodies of water. The action was to learn more about the specific invasive species that we were focusing on, and the Facebook sponsor, like you need an account to work with, was Wisconsin Lakes Partnership, which has been a long time partner of mine out of Stevens Point. So yeah, I'm just going to focus. So we kind of took the metaphor idea and kind of dialed it up as far as we could, because a lot of message frames in the real world are kind of mixed, and we really wanted to clearly differentiate. You'll also notice similar color schemes, similar font sizes. So we tested militaristic, nativist, xenophobic, and then science, like just the facts, like what do invasive species do, why should you care? And so what we found is kind of interesting is that for men, if we had more time, I would ask you, but for men, the lowest cost per click was militaristic. But that doesn't necessarily mean it's the most effective. And you can also see that science actually did just fine. And for women, science did the best, nativist second, militaristic third, and women in general were just more expensive to reach. But specifically what we were looking at is, are these arguably offensive metaphors performing better than science? And what you can see here is the basic answer is no. So what we found here is that in terms of the same cost effectiveness, same as militaristic and nativist. Same sharing with nativist and militaristic. And for the comments, I'd like to get into that, because a lot of times when I work with clients around promoting conservation, I was like, well, what do you want to do? You're thinking about strategic communication, and they're like, we want people to be engaged. I'm like, well, what do you mean by that? And they're like, we want them to be engaged. Well, I think we all know by looking around news and media that all engagement is not good, right? So you can see that in certain message frames, like the nativist one, people are saying offensive things, right? And so that is engagement. And if you were to quantitatively tabulate comments, it did get quite a few comments. But this isn't really the kind of comment that we're looking for, right? It's not the kind of conversation or engagement that we're looking for. But on a science frame, for example, people are having more authentic, science-based, rational conversations. So I just want to lay the backdrop here of why we're going to the next step. So I also want to tip my hat to my colleague Sedona Chin, who also just recently in 22 did an analysis of social media posts and also found, so what I'm doing here is a paid advertising, and she found with organic posts too that when you use militaristic or nativist language, xenophobic language, you don't get more engagement. So the messages that we're seeing so far is that we don't really need to use offensive metaphors, but they may be having unintended consequences. So why do we care if well, what are the unintended consequences? So every year I go to the Wisconsin Lakes and Rivers Conference in Stevens Point. And several years ago, Cornell ran a survey of all the Canadian provinces and Great Lakes states. And they found that Wisconsin was the most compliant state in terms of AIS prevention behaviors among boaters. So that's good news, right? However, I said, what do you think are the unintended consequences of our success in AIS prevention? And the answer was universally the same, which is that when people get an aquatic invasive species on their lake, the first thing they want to do is dump herbicides into the lake. And when I wrote this grant with Dominique, actually, one of the metaphors that I used in a paper was struck back from a surgeon. I used to work in health communication. I was talking with a breast cancer surgeon, and he was talking about how people would come in after an initial diagnosis of cancer and say, I want to get chemotherapy and a double mastectomy and radiation. He's like, whoa, 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 like slow down. Like we might do all that stuff, but that's not the first thing we do. We kind of watch and wait and listen, and that's what some people are doing with their lakes. They hear this news, and they just want to do the most aggressive thing that they can. And so the problem is that they say that some of these herbicides are targeted, but the fact of the matter is they can harm native plants. Of course they can, right? They can't be that targeted. In fact, if you look at the labels of, this is a label for 2,4-D, which is one of the most commonly used aquatic herbicides, and it's actually used on land as well. It says right on the label it can be toxic to fish and aquatic invertebrates. And one other thing I'd like to say is they say only what weeds or plants it can be used on, but what they don't say is that it also affects all the other ones. They're just saying that this is what it's used for, but they don't say it can also affect negatively other native plants, which is a problem. I also want to point out that I'm not going to go into this, but it's also clear that there's health effects of herbicides like 2,4-D, like severe burning, skin rash, stiffness of arms and legs. I mean, you're supposed to do safety precautions like wear gloves, but higher doses of herbicides can affect human health as well. I also want to point out, too, that the very word invasive species, and I've been debating this with my colleagues for some time, is problematic because 90% of the time, an invasive species does not occur in abundances that are problematic. So what this graph is showing is that a very small percentage of the time it becomes problematic, and about 90% of the time they do not reach problematic densities. So I've been debating on whether just to call them non-native species, because when you hear the word aquatic invasive species, it sounds scary, but the fact of the matter is the majority of the time, vast majority of the time, they just coexist with other plants. So the background of this study here is that there really is we're kind of like on the front of this with this study that we recently had published in Biological Invasions. There's a lot of research on aquatic invasive species prevention and pretty much no social science research on aquatic invasive species management. So like I said before, there's the DNR approached me a while back and they said, hey, we're having a problem, following up on that conversation that we had, that people are too eager to dump herbicides into their lake and they're asking for too many permits and we don't really know what to tell them. We don't know what's driving these decisions. And so we ended up getting some money to test this very question. So this is an article that came out about 2 weeks ago with Dominique and also two graduate students from LSC and another colleague of mine from Sea Grant, Tim Campbell. So what we looked at here, and this is actually some descriptive data, and I want to point out that you might go, well, how else should you manage aquatic invasive species? Well, there's a variety of different ways that you can manage them. You can do them manually, which means to literally go out and pluck them out if they're in small concentrations. Mechanical monitoring, and a lot of times monitoring, like just watching something, is considered passive, like you're not doing anything. But if 90% of the time something doesn't result in something negative, monitoring may be a very legitimate and reasonable active response, and maybe the most reasonable thing you can do. There's also physical barriers, biological control, chemical and regulatory. And you can see here that people themselves, we had about a 64% response rate on the survey amongst amongst lakeshore property owners in Wisconsin, have some concerns around the risk versus the benefits of chemical herbicides. So the basic research questions that we looked here, and we looked at the literature to see what might we think could predict preferences for chemical herbicides. So one of them was political ideology, and that is because there is some data to suggest that some ideologies are more or less environmental in terms of their attitudes. Perceived environmental threat makes sense, right? Like, oh, I think this is going to be horrible for my lake. You would think that might influence how people react to an aquatic invasive species. Familiarity with AS, like if you know more about it, and that could go both directions, right? Like the more I know about it, the more I know to kind of calm down, or I just want to get rid of them. I want to eradicate them, that kind of thing. Trust in institutions that advise about AS management. So we looked at that, like trust in like the DNR and trust in the different, university extension and that kind of people that give information about aquatic plant management. And then also there's a lot of research that shows that emotions influence the decisions that we make. So I'm not going to go over this in a detailed fashion, but we sent out a survey to 1,200 people in Wisconsin, lakeshore property owners, had 747 surveys returned, followed a Doman method where we followed up several times and we gave a $1 incentive in the envelope. And the survey was conducted by the University of Wisconsin Survey Center. And again, we had, sorry, I said 63% response rate, which is actually pretty good for this kind of survey, which means the people that received the survey were pretty interested in the topic. A lot of times it can be quite a bit lower than that. So what did we find? So what predicted preferences for chemical treatment of invasive species in your lake? So one is if they had an aquatic invasive species in their lake, they are more likely to prefer chemical herbicides. That makes sense. Interestingly, if they don't know if an aquatic invasive species is in their lake, they were also more likely to want to use chemical herbicides. The other ones is negative affect was also strong. Familiarity with AS management actually went the opposite direction that we might hope for, is that the more familiar they felt with AS management, the more likely they were to prefer chemical herbicides. And also socially conservative ideology was also correlated with preference for an aquatic plant management strategy that involves herbicides. I'll talk a little bit more about that. We don't think it's social conservatism per se, but rather it's maybe a proxy for different attitudes. So as far as the implications of that, as I was just saying, like there's different environmental attitude scales, and it's more likely that social conservatism wasn't the best measure, just something that we could actually measure and we had on our survey, but it's more likely that it's sort of a proxy for some different underlying variables. That said, it does make sense that if you had a more conservative area versus a more liberal area, that you might get this information out to those groups first, just because they're more likely to prefer chemical herbicides. We wondered if the familiarity with AIS management may well become, and we don't have a clear link between this yet, but there's reasons to believe that some of the fear-based messaging might be influencing people to make an overreaction when they find out about an invasive species in their lake. That we also, and I'll be talking about this in a second, address the emotional reactions faced in the lakes. It's scary, right? I've just found out I have cancer. That's scary. I just found out I have an invasive species in my lake. That's scary. But like, explore that a little bit more, because like I showed you before, if you were to make a bet, 90% of the time, you're not going to have that plant in sufficient abundances to be problematic. It just coexists with the other plants. And also, like, more research is needed, which academics always say, and I'll share with you about some. So what are some of the outputs? So given my extension role, we're also trying to create information. And you might look at some of this as the knowledge deficit model, but right now there isn't a lot of knowledge out there. So we're creating a variety of resources. So because before they didn't really have anything. In fact, the people that were most best at outreach were chemical companies and lake management companies that provide services about aquatic invasive species. And there's nothing wrong with that. In fact, I work with some of them. But again, and I also want to be crystal clear, lest there's anyone in the audience, is that the natural resource managers that we talk to have said that there is a role for chemical herbicides in some cases. But like I said before, in the context of cancer, it's not the first thing that you do. So we're not saying there's never a role. We're saying, like, first figure out your situation and then go on from there. So one of the things we created was kind of a fact sheet that's been broadly distributed. We put out newsletter articles in Lake Tides, which is a statewide newsletter that goes out to kind of lake leaders, lake association members, that kind of thing. And we're basically, our main goal here is kind of, it's behavioral to the degree that we want someone to be sitting around at a meeting, because you need to seek a permit. You can't just, I can't just go to Walmart or Farm and Fleet and dump a bunch of herbicides in the lake. Technically you could, but legally you have to get a permit. Because we want someone in the back of the room to say, wait, hold on a second. I have heard that that's not the first thing that you should do, and that you should, that we should think about this before we do that. We literally just want people to slow things down and be more deliberate and thoughtful. We just had a press release come out yesterday, actually, and a lot of times press releases are just about raising visibility, but our hope here is, again, to feed this notion that people will raise their hand and say, hey, whoa, slow down here, that we don't need to rush to the most aggressive strategy possible. So in terms of dissemination, too, we've also distributed this broadly. Wisconsin has a very strong aquatic invasive species coordinator network, and in fact, a quarter of a cent for every boat gasoline sold in the state goes towards aquatic invasive species prevention, and there's quite a bit of gasoline in the state. So, so we've distributed broadly to these folks, and also at a national level, we've sent it to the Aquatic Nuisance Species Task Force, and these are all the aquatic invasive species coordinators at a state level. And so we're getting the word out about, hey, some of this messaging, you might want to rethink this. As far as aquatic plant management, this is what's driving it. So we're kind of trying to change the dialogue around what people, about how people are communicated with, both about the prevention as well as the management of invasive species. So as far as the next step, and I was told to keep it about 30 minutes. I think I'll be done within 5 minutes. But as a follow-up, we received $300,000 from the Aquatic Invasive Species Interjurisdictional Grants to the Great Lakes states and tribes, and it's oftentimes in the funding world, it's called GLRI, is the kind of funding, and it comes from the federal government. And specifically what we are tasked to do is find out how are people looking for information about aquatic plant management, where are they going as a result of those searches, and how can we have enough money? There really aren't any great web resources out there. It's kind of a new space. There's little piecemeal, like a fact sheet here, a fact sheet there, but to create a website that's specifically designed and targeted to address the issue of aquatic plant management. So that's what we're working on now. So the last thing I'm going to talk about is just some kind of early steps we have. We just submitted a journal, or an article to a journal called Aquatic Plant Management, and it's super cool. We used a tool called SEM Rush, and it's used by all kinds of corporations and industries. In fact, you'll be able to see just in a second, that's also being used by chemical companies as well. To identify, so you can use this tool to identify current topics about what people are searching for. You can see that when people enter certain search terms, where are they going as a result of those searches? And you can also identify what keywords internet users, basically when they type in different terms, where do they go? And just to be clear, I think you all know this by now, but keywords aren't just a word. It can be a question, it can be a phrase, it can be a word, it can be a search term. So it's anything people type into Google in order to find their information. This particular service uses a Google, and I know there's Bing and different websites, but what we're talking about today is Google searches. So what we did, and SEMrush doesn't do this, this is something that we did, is we broke the keywords into different categories. So a vernacular category is kind of how normal people speak. Like they're not science language, it's just, they're not using, so the science you can see like the same words as you go across the rows. So milfoil, the scientific name, I'm not even going to attempt, Like the specific APO plant term is Eurasian water milfoil, general term, aquatic plants. Invasive is interesting too because you find that people, when they're looking for aquatic plant management, aren't using that many invasive terms. Like they don't put the word invasive in front of what they're looking for. They use different words, which I'll show you in just a second. Negative words, like you could call something a plant, an aquatic organism. There's different things you could call them, but when you call something a weed, it implies something you don't want. Because what is a weed? It's a plant that you don't desire around. It's also just a plant. And also control and management terms, like terms that imply they're looking about control. So we also created different categories of websites that people go to, because the program doesn't provide this either. So we wanted to break it up into institutional and governmental, and these are ones that aren't selling anything. Their goal is to get information out to the public. They're not selling anything. The whole goal is to get science out to the public. We also created a category for commercial, and in these cases, they're either selling a product, an herbicide, or a service related to lake management. So that's what they do. And then we also had to create a mixed other category, which is that like a blog, like a fishing blog, that kind of thing. So these also showed up on the main visited sites. And again, what this allowed us to do is, because if we just looked at like all hundreds of sites, it's too much to process. So we're trying to create this in a way that was useful. So I'm just going to focus on one page because I think it's really interesting, and then we could get to a discussion. But if you look above there, I don't know if this thing has a little, oh yeah, there we go. So if you look at like negative words, for example, this is the ranking of the sites. So when you see the web pages come up on the front page of Google, what are people seeing? So when you use negative words, oh, wrong button. Well, it's not working anymore. But if you look up there, when people use negative words, commercial is doing really well. And when you look up control issues, management issues, commercial is doing really well. When you use invasive, scientific institutions are doing really well. And scientific, they're of course doing really well. But I would argue that a lot of these institutional entities are trying to reach the lay public, and they seem to be reaching each other. Whereas the commercial companies seem to have it figured out that they're using the language that people are actually using when they're trying to learn about aquatic plant management. So again, what we're trying to do, and I'll give you a little example of this, is we are trying to inform science sources, government, state agencies, federal agencies, nonprofits, universities, extension, to use more of the language that people are actually using. And you get some pushback from scientists, but we're saying like, look, if you can do it in an elegant way or put in a sidebar or different things, but if you're not using the language that people are looking up, they cannot find your information. And that's a fact. And so what we're basically arguing for is that people producing content from a science standpoint need to create more diverse content in order to have people find the information that they're trying to get out. So just as one example, so we're taking like the standard fact sheets, which we've analyzed, and they usually come in at about a 14th grade reading level. And we're trying to reduce them to like an 8th grade reading level, and then work more content that we found are the top performing keywords related to the term that we're looking for. And then what we're going to look at is we're putting up a website, driving lots of Google ads to the front end of a website to see what people use. But also this should drive more organic traffic because people are more likely to find information if we're using words that they're actually using. So yeah, so I was told to come in about a half an hour or about 35 minutes. So with that in mind, I am happy to entertain any questions you may have.